In our society, Foucault continues, destiny takes the form of relationship with power, of a struggle with or against it. Indeed, the most intense point of a life, the point where its energy is concentrated, is where it comes up against power, struggles with it, attempts to use its forces and to evade its traps. These texts are, according to Foucault, the only possible monument to these infamous lives, having been nothing in history, having played no appreciable role in events or among important people, having left no identifiable trace around them, they don't have and never will have, he says, any existence outside the precarious domicile of these worlds. The encounter with these fragments of lives, with these characters malevolently described by people that wanted them arrested or sent away, is the very fabric that the letters were made of. So the visual metaphors that Foucault uses to describe the way these facts pierce the thick darkness of oblivion to reach us refer to this specific visual machine, which is the tool of surveillance per excellence, the panopticon, the center and the paradigm of discipline and punish. It is from the point of view of a juridical watchtower that these lives get covered in other people's words. Why was it so necessary, Foucault asks, to stifle them as one stifles a cry, smothers a fire, or strangles an animal? We might amuse ourselves, if we wish, by seeing a revenge in this, the chance that enabled these absolutely undistinguished people to emerge from their place amid the dead multitudes, to gesticulate again, to manifest their rage, their affliction, or their invincible determination to err. Perhaps it makes up for the bad luck that brought power's lightning bolt down upon them, in spite of their modesty and anonymity. We encounter a very similar concern at the same time and awareness of what being trapped, objectified, and portrayed by the words of power, often the only available ones, as we see, can mean for the anonymous participant of a political movement in a book signed Many Comrades, entitled Bologna, March 77, Our Own Business, where we can read, I quote, "There won't be a historian. We will not tolerate that a historian exists who will take a position of superiority through language, who will offer his services to the language of power and reconstruct the facts, superimposing himself on our own silence, an uninterrupted, infinite, furiously stranger silence." End of quote. So in an interview the same year, Foucault, in an interview published in French under the title of La torture c'est la raison, torture is reason, Foucault noted that the defeated ones are those whom by definition have been stripped of their own words. And therefore, if they were to speak, they would speak in a foreign language that has been forced upon them. They are not mute, but they do not speak either a language that hasn't been heard before, and that now we would be forced to listen to. Exactly because they were dominated, a language and its concept were forced onto them, becoming the very scars of their oppression. Those scars, those traces have impregnated their thoughts and even the attitudes of their bodies. In the same interview, Foucault will ask, has the language of the defeated ever existed? And to the same question, Spivak answered negatively in her text from 1985, Can the Subaltern Speak? The subalterns, victim of multiple discrimination caused by their position within the geopolitical global distribution of work and by their specific social situation, they cannot speak, for sure. Spivak quotes the example of the Indian widows that followed the tradition of immolating themselves on the funerary pyre of their husband, adding to their verbal, cultural, and political absence their physical one. What should be done with this negative space? Should we represent this placeless site, this heterotopia that is the continent of the excluded from any political territory? The question of representation is crucial in the following part of Spivak's text, where she accuses Deleuze and Foucault of being too superficial in their conversation from 1972, published under the title The Intellectuals and the Power. Spivak strongly argued against the theory of representation that this exchange implies, Deleuze states that the intellectual theoretician has ceased being a subject, representing or a representative consciousness. The ones that are now struggling, he says, have ceased to be represented by a party or a union that will pretend to embody their consciousness. We are all factions, there is no more representation, there is only action. Action in theory, action in practice, within relationships and network. Probably there was too much enthusiasm at the time to perceive that some people still could not access the networks and relationships that made struggles possible, and that the position that intellectuals occupied in this very context was very far, for example, from the one of the prisoners that the GIP was fighting for. Their visibility, physical and political, remained difficult to attain. Further in the same text, Spivak evokes Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where the verb to represent is employed in its double meaning that Philip was quoting of German language, Vertretung, which means talking in the place of someone or other, whether Darstellung is a term commonly used for the description and the presentation, usually within an artistic context. We should, she concludes, learn to present the unrepresented subject without speaking in their place. We should eventually represent ourselves in front of the voiceless people as simple translators of their cause. But the problem remains unresolved because as soon as we try to represent the heterogeneous and complex crowd of the excluded, we end up describing them. Spivak herself will fill in the expected list of the subaltern subjects further in the same text. Although certainly Marx was and remains the master painter of the most suggestive frescoes of the life of popular conspirators. In the 18th Brumaire, we can read the famous descriptions of the affiliated to the Society of December the 10th. I quote, alongside decayed roué with dubious means of subsistence and dubious origin, alongside ruin and adventurous offshoots of the bourgeoisie were vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged jailbirds, escaped galley slaves, swindlers, mountebanks, lazzaroni, pickpocket tricksters, gamblers, pimps, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rug pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars. In short, the whole indefinite, disintegrated mass thrown hither and thither, which the French call la bohème, end of quote. In his book from 1983 entitled The Philosopher and His Poor, Rancière had not yet begun to elaborate his theory of the sharing of the sensible as both a political and an aesthetic fact. Nonetheless, in the chapter on the bourgeois betrayal, he describes June 1848, as the crucial moment where the prediction of Marx and Engels' manifesto should have been confirmed by the events. So the truth of the book becomes then the street theater of the barricades, Rancière writes. The separation between the classes becomes visible on the two sides of the barricade. The new republic had just been baptized with the blood of the repression, and it's nothing but the dictatorship of the whole bourgeoisie as a class, stripped of its decoration and embellishments that no longer mask the real nature of power. But then suddenly, everything gets troubled. We should have seen the bourgeois domination taking place and the political history manifesting itself as the open book of the class struggle, but the book gets covered in hieroglyphs. The political scene is left by its entitled actors, the bourgeois and the proletarians, and it fills up with a troupe of comedians, the list that we've just seen of the supporters of Louis Napoleon, whose burlesque representation culminates with the election of the clown Louis Napoleon, the pitre, he calls him, Rancière. According to Rancière, the succession of these circus-like or theater-like effects on the scene that should have been the one of the class revelation unveils the disturbing truth, which is the general incapacity of social classes to exist at the only level that earns them the actual title of classes, the one of their political representation. The obscurity of the masses, the social classes as the meaningless sum of the individuals that compose them, are constant bourgeois dreads. The nocturnal Paris described by Foucault and Farge in the foreword that they both wrote for the 1982 edition of The Disorder of Families is filled with these indiscernible, infamous bodies. I quote, "The canaille that frightens and fascinates at the same time, the one that always seems to go further in depravation and wrongdoings, the one that cannot be defined as criminal but knows all the possible shelters in the city where he can hide his accomplices, his loots, and fabricate his adventurous projects, is the one that the bourgeois totally identifies with the people." End of quote. In The Disorder of Families, the poor incarnate the screen for the bourgeois projections of fear and disquiet because they're somehow illegible, opaque, depicted as a bunch of villains and wretches, as an immense wave that explodes and multiplies, that swells and disappears, and then shows up again. This seething mass with its neighborhood solidarity is an inextricable and frightening mix of laborious and dangerous classes. It is something that doesn't have a defined form and cannot meet the requirement of any sort of representation, at least not until the police breaks it into single individuals that can be identified, arrested, and punished. In a text from 1995 entitled "What is a People?", Agamben questioned the ambiguity of the term people that one finds in all modern European languages. People always designates the excluded, the poor, the deprived, but in the same time, it is the name of the constitutive subject of politics. It is at the same time the mass of the citizens as a political homogeneous body and the fragmentary multiplicity of the dispossessed. Either a form of inclusion that pretends to be totalizing, either an exclusion that is absolutely hopeless. On the one hand, it refers to all the integrated and sovereign citizens. On the other hand, to the reservation or the camp, the place of the miserable, the oppressed, and the defeated. In this bipolar concept of people, Agamben foresees the trace of a division that assigns one life to the sphere of the bios, the existence that can access language and therefore the meaningful visibility and the public speech of politics. This is a distinction from Aristotle's Politics that I guess you're familiar with, and the other one to the space of the Zoe, which will be subjected to the domination and will generate a speech that will only be heard as a noise. The core of this reflection structures the trilogy whose first volume is Homo Sacer, and Agamben's thoughts are explicitly presented as a prolongation of Foucault's analysis that is premature death left unachieved. Actually, Agamben says that this trilogy is built in the space that exists between the end of Vita Activa, when the Homo Laborans, Hannah Arendt's Vita Activa, when the Homo Laborans shows up on the political scene, so the worker, and with him basically his naked life that appears on the political scenes, and the works of Foucault on biopolitics. The main question in the relationship between naked life, the main question is the one of the relationship between naked life and politics. Inside the question, how does the living being have access to language, hides the other question that wonders, how does naked life inhabit the space of the polis, of the political, that life that has a voice but no access to language? There are politics, according to Agamben, because human beings can, within the language, separate from themselves and even oppose to themselves their own naked life, but they keep with it a relationship of inclusive exclusion. There are politics because there are bodies in the space and because the life that inhabits them is representable or not, translatable or not into the language of power. Politics happen when this border between silent and speaking people, between represented and unrepresented ones, shift when there are movements of inclusion and exclusion, but these movements modify the very subjectivities of their actors. Once the borders have moved, the subjects will have changed. They will be transformed. Foucault and Rancière underlined the same problem in their conversation in Révolte Logique, a review called Logical Revolts, printed in the winter of '77, the same time, when The Life of the Infamous Man and the appeal on the Italian Untorelli launched by Guattari against the repression of the political movement were published. In this text entitled Powers and Strategy, Foucault talks about the plebs as the constant and permanently silent target of the power apparatuses. The plebs isn't a sociologic designation, isn't something that has but it's something that has a distributive nature. There is some plebs in all classes, in the bourgeoisie, in the proletarians, in the middle class, like a chemical to be activated. It's a dormant potentiality ready to explode. It should not be regarded as the source of the subject of all, or the subject of all revolts, because it's nothing but a negative definition of what escapes the power, a centrifugal movement, an inverted energy, a line of fled, I think it can be translated a ligne de fuite within the bodies and the souls, a limitation and a counterpart to any productive progress of the government. So the plebs enter the Foucauldian toolbox as the exact opposite of a subject to describe. It actually gives the shape to a political machine of vision. What counts aren't the primitive rights chanted by neoliberalism, nor their fetishization promoted by neopopulism, but the point of view of the plebs, because this reveals the apparatuses and allows the construction of strategies of resistance. The review Revolte Logique was born at the time, this is Rancière himself that says that, of the large monographs on the villages and their land, the terroir, on the biographies of the fierce men from the humble classes, of the evocation of popular carnivals or the plebeian barbarism. As Rancière writes in The People's Scene, instead of the basic proletarian of the Marxist science, what began to emerge was a noisy and colorful people, but also a people totally conformed to its essence, rooted in its place and its time, ready to go from the legend of the low-born people towards the positivity of the silent majority. The reaction against the Marxist revolutionary mythology that was then directly associated to the mass crime of the Gulag created this image of immaculate plebs upraising spontaneously, where converged both the immediate positivity of the popular body and the pure negativity of the resistance to power. In the problematic triad that during the 70s associates proletarians, people, and plebs, the latter that, according to Rancière, catalyzed the projection as a new revolutionary subject, was in Foucault, as we've seen, the very opposite of a subject. It actually pointed to a space of desubjectivization, or the subjectification, as you say it in English. Within the context of Foucault research on critique as a response to governmentality, plebs is the anonymous artist consistently perfecting the art of not being governed, the author of the transhistorical ready-made, consisting in the mass of the strategies of resistance to the power that flees the statistic and any attempt to trace its movement. The ways in which it is included in the public space are always paradoxical, because the plebs finds itself on the border between the logos and the phone, between meaningful language and inarticulate noise. His existence is what physically opposes itself to the power by putting his body in the upraising, by performing a daily resistance to governmentality, and therefore what decomposes the illusion of the political space as a purely linguistic and representative one. The point of view of the plebs reveals that power relationships go across the bodies. It reveals the body as an object constantly contained and controlled, and not as a form that we all have in common as human beings. In that sense, the plebs is often identified to the body because it is what brings it back to the political scene, as its consistently removed protagonist that every speech mentions by denying it and denies it by mentioning it. In the body of each political representative of every democratic state hide the silent and dangerous mass of the unrepresented people, of the people whose representation isn't and will never be incarnated by a single person. And maybe in this silence lies the disturbing lesson that we should have learned from the cults of personalities and their tragedies. The way power contains the plebs through the prison system and the juridical apparatus was analyzed in a crazy dialogue, actually, on popular justice from 1972, which is a dialogue between Benny Lévy, André Glucksmann, and Foucault. But Benny Lévy and André Glucksmann are talking under their Maoist names. So one is called Victor and the other one I don't know. So it's not even their real identity they are using, and it's something like a political trial to Foucault, this conversation. And Foucault says that the tribunal is a machine of revelation of guilt. It makes it visible through its architecture, the table that separates the judges from the judged ones, which is the spatial representation of neutrality. Even in its revolutionary variant, it will never solve the contradictions between proletarians and bourgeois because its purpose is conservative and anti-seditious. The outcome always is the one of imprisoning or punishing the bodies. The table with the chairs on its two sides has historically produced a dividing line that breaks the insurrections and separates the plebs from the proletarians. This dispositif always extracted from the confused mass of people an underworld of marginalized, dangerous, threatening ones by sending them to prison, to the hospital, to the galleys, to the colonies. Hence, it's not surprising to see the immoral portrait of the plebs painted by so many writers and philosophers, because its voice is a FONTAINE and its social reality is an abstraction until the repressive apparatus hits it. 1977 is nearly finished. The year that saw Foucault working the most intensely on these problems was in Italy the year of the plebs. There are reasons that bring us to believe that Foucault was an attentive observer of these events, that he wasn't satisfied by their official version, the one of the years of lead, of the state-driven terrorism, of a purely reactive struggle that was only aiming to rescue a fragile democracy still debilitated by its recent fascist past. He was one of the signers of Guattari's appeal against the criminalization of the movement. 77 in Italy is the year that is never commemorated, that's how we call it, because the surface of the present changed that year in several places. Moroni, which was the main archivist of the movement, wrote that Piazza Maggiore in Bologna, Campo dei Fiori in Rome, Piazza Mercanti in Milan, and many other public spaces were effectively temporary autonomous zones. Eco wrote that Bologna's arcades were entirely covered with graffiti and drawings. They looked like Saint-Ombly's paintings. The walls were abandoned to the spontaneity of writing. They were an open space that called for collective participation and that offered an indefinite possibility to replicate. Graffiti multiplied. Two of them created an epidemic. Tony Negri says that whomever would come to Milan during the summer of '76 couldn't avoid Parco Lambro, a park where the proletarian youth camped, and the movement squatted a Pacific Music Festival, transforming it into a liberated place, assaulting the food truck on the second day, assaulting supermarkets to feed the temporary Indian reservation. The cities were full of occupied houses, and entire neighborhoods refused to pay bills and rent, and not only supermarkets were pillaged, but also luxury stores, because as we know, nothing is too beautiful for the proletarians, as they used to say. The most advanced branch of the feminist movement preached the abandon of all rights. They didn't believe in the image that power gave them of themselves, and the law gave them of themselves. These women, in the middle of the struggles for the legalization of abortion, the penalization of rape, the application of the affirmative action, demanded the silence of the law on their destiny and their body. Women's bodies had always been ascribed at the area of the FONTAINE, the unintelligent language of emotions. One of their main slogans was, "Don't believe you have any rights," which meant, do not believe that you will be included in the apparatus that excluded you until yesterday without being abused. I would like to conclude this paper that, as I was saying, is part of an ongoing research, so it doesn't really have a conclusion, with the words of Leah, published in a feminist fanzine from 1976. I quote Leah: "The return of the removed threatens all my projects of work, research, politics, but does it threaten them, or it is the truly political element in myself to which I should give space and attention? The silence was negating and forcing to a setback this part of myself that wanted to do politics, but it was affirming something new. There has been a change. I have started to speak, but these days I've understood that the affirmative part of me was occupying all the space again. I got convinced that the mute woman is the most fecund objection to our politics. The non-political digs tunnels that we mustn't fill with earth." Thank you.